The world didn't end with a bang, but with the sickening clatter of a silver platter on stone. My clumsy fall sent me sprawling onto the one place I was forbidden to even breathe near. Before the last echo died, every wolf in the hall was on their feet, and I was looking up from the Alpha's throne into the eyes of the man who was about to kill me. The great hall of the Black Moon Pack smelled like power. It was a thick, choking scent, a blend of roasting boar, ancient wood smoke, and the metallic tang of dominance that clung to the air like a shroud. For Elira, it was the smell of a world she served but could never join. Her only job was to be a ghost, a whisper of movement in the chaos of the Alpha's feast. She kept her head down, her worn leather tunic a stark contrast to the silks and furs of the wolves who laughed and drank around her. Their laughter was a physical force, a series of blows against the fragile shield of her invisibility. Don't be seen. Don't be heard. Don't exist. The words were a prayer, a desperate mantra she repeated with every step she took on the cold stone floor. Her arms ached, the heavy silver platter of spiced wine goblets digging into her flesh. She moved through the throng of bodies, a current of heat and noise. A hulking beta, his face flushed with mead, grabbed a goblet without looking at her, his knuckles brushing her hand. The touch was like a spark of ice, a casual reminder of her place. She was less than the dirt on his boots, a necessary tool, nothing more. A bitter taste, sharp as bile, rose in her throat. She swallowed it down. Bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford. It made you careless, and carelessness got you punished. Continuing from her last thought, she focused on her task. The Alpha King, a mountain of grizzled fury and old cruelties, sat at the head table. His eyes, small and dark like chips of obsidian, swept the room with an owner's possessiveness. Beside him, the Luna wore a smile as sharp and beautiful as a shard of glass. But it was the third seat at the table that held a different kind of dread. The Alpha's throne. It was carved from the heart of a single massive ironwood tree, its surface polished to a dark, menacing sheen by generations of Alphas. It sat empty tonight, as it always did during feasts. An elder's voice, raspy with age, drifted from a nearby table. Cursed it is. Only the true Alpha's mate can sit and live. Anyone else who dares... Well, the last fool who tried was ash before sunrise. The wolves around him chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through Elira's bones. The throne seemed to drink the firelight, its shadows deep and hungry. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down her spine. Why did it feel like it was watching her? She shook the feeling away. It was just a chair. An ugly, dangerous chair. Her focus needed to be on the here and now. A high-ranking female with jewels braided into her hair looked up as Elira approached her table. The woman's lips curled into a sneer. Omega, more wine. And try not to spill your weakness all over the table this time. The insult was delivered with a lazy, bored cruelty. Elira's knuckles went white around the edge of the platter, but she bowed her head, her long, dark hair falling forward to hide the flush of shame heating her cheeks. Yes, my lady. Her voice was a mouse's whisper, exactly as it was supposed to be. She carefully refilled the goblet, her hands steady despite the tremor that ran through her. As a direct consequence of this humiliation, something inside her frayed. She had spent years perfecting the art of being nothing, of folding herself into the shadows until she practically disappeared. It was how she survived. But tonight, the weight of their scorn felt heavier, the air thicker, the laughter louder. It felt like a cage whose walls were pressing in, squeezing the very breath from her lungs. She turned away from the table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She just needed to get back to the kitchens, back to the familiar quiet and the steam that could hide her face. For that reason, she moved faster than she should have. A warrior, laughing at some crude joke, stretched his leg out into the aisle. Elira didn't see it. Her foot caught, and the world tilted sideways in a horrifying slow-motion cascade of disaster. The silver platter flew from her grasp. A dozen goblets of dark red wine spun through the air like scattered jewels. The sound was a symphony of destruction, a clang of metal, a series of sharp cracks as crystal met stone. But it was the silence that followed that was the most terrifying sound of all. Before the last echo of shattering crystal had died, every eye in the great hall was on her. 100 pairs of predatory eyes. They weren't looking at the spreading stain of wine on the ancient stones or the glittering shards of broken goblets. They were looking at her, at Elira, the ghost who had just made a very, very loud noise. And in that moment, she wasn't a ghost at all. She was flesh and bone and pure, undiluted terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone, desperate to escape. She lay sprawled on the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold, rough stone that smelled of damp earth and spilled mead. But it wasn't the fall that held the hall captive in its sudden, breathless silence. It was where she had fallen. She had landed at the foot of the dais, her outstretched hand touching the base of the Alpha's cursed throne. Across the vast room, from the shadows near the hearth where he always stood, he moved. Kalen, the Alpha Heir, the future king of their pack. He wasn't sitting at the head table with his father. He never did. He preferred the darkness, a sentinel wrapped in silence and scars. One of those scars, a jagged white line, cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his dark hairline, a permanent reminder of a battle no one dared speak of. His face was all harsh angles and cold fury, a mask of stone that betrayed nothing. But his eyes were a startling molten gold, the color of a wolf's eyes in the dead of night, and they burned with an intensity that could strip a soul bare. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, a terrifying, destructive force of nature. Whispers followed him like his own shadow, clinging to him wherever he went. Elira had heard them her whole life. "He killed her, you know," a kitchen maid had once whispered, her voice trembling. The one he was meant to love, his own fated mate, he lost control, tore her apart. The story was a ghost that haunted the pack, a cautionary tale about the beast that lived inside even the strongest among them. Because of this, Elira had always seen him not as a future alpha, but as a broken thing, a monster disguised as a prince. She saw the same cruel fire in him that she saw in his father, just caged behind a younger, colder facade. She hated him for it. She hated his power, his silence, his scars. She hated him because he was everything she wasn't, seen, feared, and respected. As he began to cross the floor, his movements were liquid and deadly, the walk of a predator who owned the ground he covered. The crowd parted for him like the sea before a god. His gaze was fixed on her, and there was no pity in it, no mercy. There was only a cold, hard finality. He was judge, jury, and executioner, and she had just committed a crime punishable by death, disrupting the Alpha's feast, and worse, touching the sacred throne. Her breath hitched in her throat. This was it. This was how her small, miserable life ended. Not with a whimper in the dark, but as a spectacle for the very wolves who had made her feel worthless. A fitting, cruel end. He stopped just a few feet from her, a towering shadow that blocked out the firelight. The scent of him rolled off him in waves, pine, winter frost, and something else, something wild and dangerous that made the Omega in her want to flatten herself against the floor and show her throat in submission. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, his handsome face a mask of indifference. "Get up," he commanded. His voice wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a low, quiet rumble that cut through the silence of the hall and promised pain. It was the sound of a gathering storm, and Elira knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the storm was about to break directly over her head. The final moments of her life were ticking away, and they were all at the mercy of the scarred king. Obeying the command was an act of pure instinct. Elira's trembling limbs pushed her up from the floor, her body moving before her mind could fully process the terror that had frozen it. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the scuffed toes of her boots, unable to face the molten gold of Kalen's gaze. The silence in the hall was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound, all breath. It was a silence filled with anticipation, a hunger for the violence that was sure to come. She could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, could feel their scorn and their bloodlust. She was the night's entertainment, a broken little mouse for the wolves to watch get torn apart. She braced herself for the blow, for the sharp, searing pain that would end it all. Just as this thought crossed her mind, a new commotion erupted. A different beta, bolder and drunker than the first, shoved his way forward. "Let me handle this, Prince Kalen," he snarled, a string of drool clinging to his lip. "An Omega that clumsy is a liability. A quick snap of the neck is a mercy." He reached for her, his thick sausage-like fingers grasping for her arm. Elira flinched back. A choked sob caught in her throat, but his hand never reached her. Kalen moved so fast he was a blur. One moment he was standing a few feet away. The next, his hand was clamped around the drunk beta's wrist. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the hall. The beta howled, a high-pitched scream of agony as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his broken arm. Kalen hadn't even looked at him. His burning gaze was still locked on Elira. This unexpected act of protection. It made no sense. It shattered her reality. He was supposed to be the monster, the one she should fear most. But he had just saved her from another. The confusion was a dizzying wave that nearly sent her to her knees. Why? Why would he do that? The beta on the floor was whimpering, and it was that sound that seemed to pull Elira back into her own nightmare. She stumbled backward, trying to put distance between herself and the violence, between herself and the scarred Heir, who was the source of it all. Her bare heel hit something hard. The dais. She lost her footing, her arms flailing wildly for purchase. There was nothing to grab. She fell backward, a gasp tearing from her lips. The landing was surprisingly soft. Not the hard stone she expected, but polished ancient wood that seemed to hum with a strange energy against her back. The collective gasp of the entire pack was a physical blow, a wave of sound and shock that was 1,000 times louder than before. Elira's eyes shot open. She was no longer on the floor. She was sitting. She was sitting on the Alpha's throne, the cursed throne. The seat of power from which no one but the true Alpha's mate could rise alive. The air crackled. The fire in the great hearth seemed to shrink, pulling away from her. The world went still. Death was no longer a promise. It was a certainty. She looked up, her gaze finally meeting Kalen's, and everything changed. The cold indifference on his face shattered. His eyes widened, the molten gold swirling with a storm of disbelief and something else. Something she had never seen there before. A raw, primal shock. His nostrils flared, and he took a sharp, deep breath. It was as if he was scenting the air for the first time. His stone mask crumbled, revealing a flash of raw, untamed emotion. Recognition. Pure, undeniable recognition. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The beast inside him, the one he kept so tightly leashed, was suddenly clawing at the surface, staring out at her through his eyes. The whispers of the elders, the stories of the curse, the legend of the fated mate, it all crashed down on Elira in a single terrifying wave of understanding. The throne hadn't killed her. And in the stunned, horrified, and utterly captivated eyes of Kalen, the Alpha Heir, she finally understood why. The silence broke as he took a single, deliberate step toward her, his voice finally breaking through, a low, guttural growl that was both a question and a claim. You. The word hung in the air between them, a single, guttural syllable that rewrote the world. You. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a discovery so profound it had shaken the foundations of the cold, merciless Alpha Heir. Elira could feel the power of the throne beneath her, a humming, ancient energy that seemed to connect directly to the raw, astonished soul she now saw in Kalen's golden eyes. For a split second, the mask was gone. She saw not the monster, not the scarred prince, but a man, a wolf, staring at the face of his own destiny. And it terrified him. The spell shattered. The Alpha King rose from his seat at the head table, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "Kaelin, what is the meaning of this? Kill the wretched Omega. She has defiled the sacred throne." His voice was a whip crack of command, a sound that had never been disobeyed. The entire pack tensed, their bloodlust reignited by their king's fury. They expected a swift, brutal execution. They craved it. Alira's blood ran cold. The moment of strange connection was over, and reality came crashing back in. Kaelin's face hardened, the mask of cold indifference slamming back into place so fast it gave her whiplash. He blinked once, and the man she had seen was gone, replaced once more by the monster. He turned his head slightly, not looking at his father, but addressing the entire hall. His voice, when it came, was laced with ice. "No." A collective gasp rippled through the room. No one said no to the Alpha King. It was unthinkable. A death sentence. Kaelin's father's face purpled with rage. "What did you say, boy?" he roared, his hand gripping the hilt of the dagger at his belt. Kaelin finally turned to face him, his posture exuding a calm, lethal authority that challenged the king's own. "I said no," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "She is not to be harmed." He then looked back at Elira, his gaze now unreadable, as cold as a winter frost. "She is my prisoner." The proclamation landed like a physical blow. Prisoner? Not dead? The pack murmured in confusion, their bloodlust turning to a buzzing curiosity. It made no sense. The law was absolute. The punishment for her crime was death. To claim her as a prisoner was an unprecedented act of defiance. Elira stared at him, her mind reeling. He was sparing her life. But why? To what end? A life as his prisoner seemed little better than a swift death. As royal guards approached her, their faces grim, she felt a new sensation. A strange, insistent pull from deep within her, an invisible thread that was suddenly tied to the Alpha Heir. It was a magnetic force, a desperate, aching need to be closer to him, and it terrified her more than the threat of execution. The mate bond. It was real. As the guards hauled her to her feet, their rough hands bruising her arms, the elder who had spoken of the curse before whispered again, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "The throne. It did not burn her. The legends are true. Only the true Alpha's mate can sit and live." The words spread through the hall like wildfire, a hiss of rumor and disbelief. Mate. The word echoed in the cavernous space, filled with shock and scorn. An Omega? A clumsy, worthless servant? Mate to the future Alpha King? It was impossible. A cosmic joke. A disgrace. From the corner of her eye, she saw the Luna's beautiful face twist into a mask of pure hatred. Kaelin's gaze swept over the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. They feared him more than they feared the king. As she was dragged away from the hall and toward the dungeons, the invisible thread connecting her to Kaelin stretched taut, and a sharp physical pain bloomed in her chest, a silent scream for a connection she didn't want and couldn't understand. She was alive, but her life was no longer her own. It belonged to him. The dungeon was a place of cold and forgetting. It smelled of damp stone, old sorrows, and the metallic tang of despair. They threw her into a cell, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the marrow of her bones. A single, high window let in a sliver of moonlight, a cruel reminder of the world she had just been torn from. She was alone. Utterly. Completely alone. And yet, she wasn't. The moment the door closed, separating her from the rest of the world, the pain in her chest exploded. It wasn't a dull ache anymore, it was a searing, tearing agony, as if her very soul was being ripped in two. A scream tore from her throat, raw and animalistic. She collapsed onto the rough stone floor, curling into a tight ball as waves of torment washed over her. It was a phantom pain, a wound with no source. Her body was unharmed, but her heart felt like it was being physically crushed. The bond. This was the agony of the bond when a mate was rejected or separated, but he hadn't rejected her. He had claimed her as a prisoner. Was this his intent? To spare her life only to subject her to a slow, torturous death in the dark? The thought fueled a fresh wave of hatred for him, a hot, defiant fury that battled against the overwhelming pain. She would not let him break her. She would not die like this. Meanwhile, in his private chambers, Kalen slammed his fist into a stone wall. The impact sent a spiderweb of cracks through the ancient masonry. But he felt nothing. Nothing except the same, tearing agony that was ripping Elira apart in the dungeon below. His wolf clawed at the inside of his mind, a raging, frantic beast howling for its mate. Ours! Go to her! Protect her! Heal her! He gritted his teeth, a low growl escaping his throat. Be silent, he hissed to the beast within, his knuckles white. He couldn't go to her. He couldn't show weakness. The entire pack, his father, their rivals, they were all watching. They saw a worthless Omega who had somehow survived the throne. They couldn't know the truth. They couldn't see her as his mate. To do so would be to paint a target on her back so large no one could miss. His father would see her as a tool to control him. His rivals would see her as a weakness to be exploited. This was why he'd killed the last one. The memory, sharp and bloody, rose unbidden. Camilla. Sweet, gentle Camilla. A beta he had loved with all his heart, though she was not his fated. His enemies had discovered his affection for her and used it. They had used her to get to him, and in the ensuing battle, in a blind rage, his untamed wolf had... He cut the thought off. The self-loathing, a familiar, bitter taste. He would not make that mistake again. He would not let his heart be used as a weapon against him. He would protect this new mate, this impossible Omega girl, by being the monster everyone already believed him to be. He would keep her at a distance, treat her with cruelty, make the world believe she was nothing to him but a political pawn. It was the only way to keep her alive. The pain in his chest was a worthy price for her safety. It was his penance. Down in the cell, hours bled into an eternity of torment. Elira's throat was raw from screaming. Just when she thought she could bear it no longer, she heard the scrape of a key in the lock. The iron door creaked open. Kalen stood there, silhouetted against the torchlight from the hall, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The moment he stepped inside the cell, the agony in her chest eased. It didn't disappear, but it receded from a raging inferno to a throbbing, manageable ache. The relief was so profound it made her dizzy. Her eyes widened as the impossible truth slammed into her. The pain. It lessened when he was near. The bond was a chain, and proximity was the only balm for the wounds it inflicted. He looked down at her, his golden eyes sweeping over her pathetic, trembling form on the floor. "Get up, prisoner," he said. "Lessons?" Elira croaked, her voice raw. She pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle felt bruised from the hours of agonizing tension. She looked at him, confused and defiant. "What lessons?" Kalen's lip curled in a faint sneer. He looked every bit the cruel prince she had always imagined him to be. "You are to be presented before the council tomorrow," he stated, his tone flat. "You are an embarrassment. A clumsy, weak Omega who has, by some fluke, become a political problem. I will not have my prisoner shaming me with her weakness. You will learn to fight." He tossed a bundle onto the floor. It was a set of plain, black training leathers, softer and more durable than her servant's tunic. The irony was not lost on her. He was going to teach her to fight, to prepare her for a trial where her death was the most likely outcome. It was a cruel, twisted game, and she hated him for it. But as she looked at him, she could feel the truth of the bond humming between them. The closer he was, the less she hurt. This proximity, this forced intimacy, was both a relief and its own special kind of torture. He was the source of her torment and the only cure for it. He led her from the dungeons to a secluded training yard, hidden behind the main keep. The moon was high and full, casting the packed earth in a ghostly silver light. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp soil. It was the first fresh air she'd had since the feast, and she drank it in greedily. The yard was empty, just the two of them, alone under the moon. He began without preamble, his voice sharp and impersonal as he walked her through basic defensive stances. Your center of gravity is low. Use it. Never let them see your fear. Use their arrogance against them. His instructions were clipped, but his hands. When he reached out to adjust her posture, his touch was like lightning. A jolt of pure electric energy shot through her, warming her skin and making her heart stutter. The bond flared to life, a hungry, purring thing that reveled in the contact. She saw him flinch, his jaw tightening as he pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He felt it too. This raw, undeniable chemistry that went beyond a simple physical pull. It was a connection of the soul, and it was clear he hated it as much as she did. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and a voice that was smooth as silk but held the coldness of steel. Well, well, training the new pet, Kaelin? A tall, handsome wolf stepped out of the shadows. He had hair the color of spun silver and eyes as pale and blue as a winter sky. He was dressed in the fine, dark furs of the north, and he moved with a predator's grace that rivaled Kaelin's own. Lord Valerius of the Silver Fang Pack, a rival alpha and one known for his cunning and ambition. Valerius's pale eyes raked over Alira, a slow, appreciative smirk playing on his lips. I must say, I am surprised. When I heard an Omega had survived the throne, I assumed it was a jest. But to see her with my own eyes... He took a step closer. She has a fire in her. I can see it. Kaelin moved almost imperceptibly, placing himself slightly between Alira and the rival alpha. It was a subtle, protective gesture that he probably didn't even realize he had made. What do you want, Valerius? Kaelin's voice was a low growl. Valerius held up his hands in a gesture of peace, though his eyes gleamed with anything but. I simply came to offer a solution to your... predicament, he said smoothly. She is clearly a problem for you. An Omega mate is a political disaster. Your father will never accept it. The pack will see it as a sign of weakness. He then looked directly at Alira, his smile widening. So I am offering to take her off your hands. My pack is more... progressive. We would welcome a Luna of such proven destiny. I would treat her as the queen she is clearly meant to be. The offer hung in the air, a blatant, audacious challenge. He wasn't just offering to take Alira. He was offering to steal Kaelin's fated mate right out from under him. The possessive fury that exploded in Kaelin's golden eyes was terrifying to behold. His control snapped, and a feral snarl ripped from his throat, the sound of a beast ready to kill. Before he could lunge, the captain of the guard appeared, his face grim. Prince Kaelin, Lord Valerius, the Alpha King summons you both. He has convened the council. The Omega's trial is to begin now. The council chamber was a den of wolves. It was smaller than the Great Hall, but far more intimidating. The walls were hung with the pelts of ancient beasts and the captured banners of fallen enemies. A great, circular stone table dominated the room, and around it sat the most powerful members of the Black Moon Pack, the elders, the lead warriors, and the Alpha King himself, seated on a throne less ornate but more imposing than the one in the hall. Alira was forced to stand in the center of the room, a lone sheep surrounded by a circle of predators. The air was thick with hostility, a palpable pressure that made it hard to breathe. She felt naked, exposed, every part of her judged and found wanting. Kaelin stood a few feet away from her, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold detachment. To her right, Lord Valerius lounged in a guest's chair, watching the proceedings with an amused, calculating glint in his pale blue eyes. The Alpha King, a vein throbbing in his temple, began the proceedings without preamble. "The law is clear," he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Omega defiled the sacred throne. The punishment is death. We are here merely to carry out the sentence." An elder, his face a roadmap of ancient wrinkles, nodded grimly. "He speaks the truth. It has always been so." Elira's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Kaylin's strange defiance in the hall was just a temporary reprieve, a delay of the inevitable. She was going to die here. She braced herself, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. If she was going to die, she would not die cowering like a frightened mouse. She would look her executioner in the eye. But Kaylin spoke before the king could give the order. "The law is clear," he agreed, his voice calm and steady, cutting through his father's rage. "But the circumstances are unique." He let the word hang in the air. The throne did not harm her. The curse, which has claimed the life of every other unworthy wolf who has touched it, did nothing. Are we to ignore a sign from the moon goddess herself? His argument sent a ripple of uncertainty through the council. They were wolves of tradition and law, but they were also wolves of faith and superstition. To defy a sign from the goddess was a grave matter. Valerius seized the opportunity, his smooth voice sliding into the tense silence. "The prince has a point, Your Majesty. It would be foolish to kill a wolf who so clearly has the goddess's favor. Perhaps she is not a curse, but a blessing, a gift that should be cherished." His eyes flickered toward Elira, a possessive gleam in their depths. The Alpha King slammed his fist on the table, making the elders jump. "Favor? She is an Omega, a worthless, clumsy servant. She is a disgrace to this pack and to my bloodline." His gaze shifted to Kaylin, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This is about your weakness, isn't it? You see another stray you think you can save, just like you tried with that beta girl. What was her name? Camilla? Look how well that ended." Kaylin flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. But Elira saw it. She saw the flash of raw, unbearable pain in his golden eyes before the mask of ice slammed back down. The mention of that name was a knife to his soul. It was the source of his scars, the ghost that haunted him. In that instant, she understood that his cruelty wasn't born of malice. It was born of a pain so deep it had frozen him from the inside out. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or hatred for him. It was a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. Kaylin ignored the jibe, his voice remaining level. "This is not about weakness. It is about strength. To kill her now would be an act of fear. It would show our rivals that we are ruled by superstition, not by logic. She is more valuable alive than dead." He then delivered his masterstroke. "She is my prisoner. Her fate is mine to decide. Let me train her. Let me see what this favor of the goddess truly means. If she proves useless, I will kill her myself." His cold promise hung in the air, a chilling vow that, paradoxically, had just saved her life. The nightly training sessions became Elira's new reality. Kaylin was a harsh, unforgiving teacher. He pushed her until her muscles screamed in protest and her lungs burned for air. He showed her no mercy, pointing out every flaw, every moment of hesitation. "You're too slow," he would bark, easily sidestepping her clumsy attack. "You telegraph your moves. Do it again. Your footing is weak. Your enemy would have you on your back in a second. Again." His words were lashes, designed to sting, to humiliate. He treated her like a recalcitrant weapon he was trying to beat into shape. Yet, beneath the cold cruelty, there was something else. A strange, focused intensity. He wasn't just teaching her to fight, he was teaching her to survive. He was forging her weakness into a weapon. Despite the harshness of his words, his actions told a different story. When he demonstrated a move, His touch was electric, a searing heat that left her skin tingling long after he had pulled away. The bond between them hummed constantly, a low, thrumming current of awareness. She could feel his presence even with her eyes closed. She knew when he was frustrated, when he was impressed, when he was fighting his own instincts. She learned to read the subtle tells behind his mask of stone, the slight flare of his nostrils when her scent washed over him, the tightening of his jaw when she landed a solid block, the way his golden eyes would darken with a hunger he fought so desperately to conceal. He was at war with himself, and she was the battlefield. Tonight, the moon was a sliver of silver in the inky sky, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. He was pushing her harder than ever. "You rely too much on what you see," he growled, circling her in the dusty yard. A true wolf uses all their senses: scent, sound, instinct. Close your eyes. "What?" she panted, her chest heaving. "Close them," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Hesitantly she did. The world went dark, and her other senses immediately sharpened. She could hear the soft scuff of his boots on the packed earth, the whisper of his breathing. She could smell the pine on the night air, the damp soil, and the intoxicating wood smoke and winter scent that was uniquely his. Now. His voice was a low murmur right beside her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. Defend yourself. He came at her in a silent rush. She didn't see him, but she felt him, a shift in the air, a spike in the energy of the bond. She threw her arm up on pure instinct, her forearm meeting his with a solid thud. His attack was powerful, but she held her ground. Her eyes flew open in shock. She had done it. A slow, dangerous smile touched Kaylin's lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly handsome. "Good," he breathed, his voice a low rumble. Again. The fight changed. It was no longer a lesson. It became a dance. A raw, primal dance of attack and defense, of predator and prey. They moved together, a blur of motion under the moonlight, their bodies brushing, their hands clasping. Every point of contact was a brand, a spark that threatened to ignite the simmering tension between them into a raging inferno. He lunged, and she twisted away, but not fast enough. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his hard, muscular chest. Her breath hitched. She could feel the heat of him, the frantic beat of his heart against her back. It hammered in perfect rhythm with her own. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "Elira," he groaned, his voice thick with a strangled desire. His control finally snapped. The beast inside him surfaced, hungry and possessive. His fangs grazed the sensitive skin above her pulse point, the spot where a mating mark was claimed. A jolt of pure, unadulterated pleasure pain shot through her. In that moment, she didn't want to fight him. She wanted to surrender. She wanted to be claimed. Just as his fangs were about to break the skin, a gasp of agony tore from Kaylin's throat. He shoved her away from him as if she were made of fire, stumbling backward until his back hit the cold stone wall of the keep. He slid down to the ground, his head in his hands, his body racked with tremors. His wolf was at war with the man, a battle so violent it was causing him physical pain. He had almost done it. He had almost marked her, claimed her, and in doing so, he would have signed her death warrant. He had lost control. The one thing he had sworn would never happen again. Elira stood frozen, her hand pressed to her neck where his fangs had been. The skin there tingled, then burned. A strange, pleasant heat that spread through her veins like warm honey. She looked down at her hand, and in the pale moonlight, she saw it. A faint, silvery light was pulsing from her skin, right over her pulse point. It was a delicate, intricate pattern, like a crescent moon surrounded by a swirl of shimmering stars. The light was soft but undeniable, a magical tattoo that had not been there a moment before. The bond. It had reacted to his intent. It had manifested physically. She looked at Kaelin, who was still fighting for control against the wall. He finally looked up, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of horror, awe, and utter despair. He saw the glowing mark on her neck. His breath hitched. "No," he whispered, the word filled with a terrible finality. "It can't be." He knew what it was. The legends were known to all alphas. The mark of the moon goddess, an irrefutable divine sign that two souls were a true fated pair, a bond blessed by the goddess herself. It was a mark of immense power, a mark that had not been seen in their pack for over 500 years. It was undeniable. It was a miracle. And it was a catastrophe. This mark made her more than just his mate. It made her a symbol, a prize, a target. It made her the most powerful and the most vulnerable wolf in the entire kingdom. He couldn't hide her now. He couldn't pretend she was nothing. The goddess herself had just proclaimed her everything. With a strangled cry, Kaelin surged to his feet and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the keep, leaving Elira alone in the moonlight with the impossible, glowing proof of their bond burning on her skin. She stood there for a long time, her mind reeling, her fingers tracing the warm, silvery light on her neck. She was shaken, terrified, but also exhilarated. A part of her, a deep, hidden part she had never known existed, felt a sense of rightness, of belonging. She was not nothing. She was chosen. Her heart ached with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow for the man who had just run from her, the man who was so clearly terrified of the connection that bound them together. A soft footstep behind her made her spin around, her hand still protectively covering the glowing mark. It was Lord Valerius. He stepped out from behind a shadowed archway, his pale blue eyes fixed on her neck. He had seen everything. "A true moon mark," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that chilled her to the bone. "I had heard the legends, but to see it, magnificent." He came closer, his silver hair glowing in the moonlight. He stopped just in front of her, his gaze intense. "Kaelin is a fool," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. "He runs from a gift that most alphas would kill for." He reached out, his cool fingers gently brushing her hand away from her neck so he could see the mark more clearly. "He does not deserve you." Elira tried to pull back, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, a new sense of danger prickling her skin. Valerius's smile was predatory. "Oh, but I should," he countered softly. "You see, this changes everything. The goddess has revealed her hand." His thumb stroked the glowing mark, sending an unpleasant shiver through her. "Kaelin may be your fated mate now," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But there was a time, not so long ago, when you were promised to me. You were my almost mate, little one, and I always collect what is mine." Valerius's words were a poison dart, sinking deep and spreading a cold venom of doubt through her veins. My almost mate. The claim was a phantom, a lie spun from the night air, yet the absolute conviction in his pale, winter sky eyes made her falter. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her expression, and his smile widened, a sharp, predatory curve of his lips. "That's impossible," Elira managed, her voice a reedy whisper. She tried to yank her arm from his grasp, but his fingers were like a steel trap, cold and unyielding. The strength in him was immense, a quiet, controlled power that was somehow more unnerving than Kaelin's explosive fury. "Is it?" he murmured, his voice a silken caress that made her skin crawl. "Truth is a complicated thing in this pack, little one. It gets buried, twisted, forgotten, especially when it is inconvenient for the man on the throne." He leaned closer, his scent, of cold stone and mountain air, a stark contrast to Kaelin's earthy warmth. "Ask yourself why a servant girl, an Omega, would be promised to an Alpha from another pack. It makes no sense, unless she wasn't always just a servant girl." The words were a riddle wrapped in a threat, designed to fracture her trust in everything she knew. He was planting seeds, and she could feel them taking root in the fertile ground of her confusion. Kalen's family is known for taking what isn't theirs. He is his father's son. He will break you, Valerius continued, his voice dropping lower. He is a walking wound, a ghost haunted by the girl he already destroyed. He will bleed all over you until you drown in his darkness. Before Elira could process the venom in his words, a blur of pure, silent fury erupted from the shadows. Kalen moved with a speed that was not entirely natural, a dark flash of vengeance. He didn't roar or shout. The only sound was the sickeningly loud crack of bone as he slammed into Valerius, his hand engulfing the rival Alpha's wrist and snapping it with a single, brutal twist. Valerius cried out, a sharp hiss of agony, stumbling backward and cradling his shattered arm. Kalen stood over him, a low, feral growl rumbling in his chest, his golden eyes blazing with a light that looked like the fires of hell. Do not touch her. Each word was a death threat, a promise of annihilation. Kalen straightened, turning his back on the groaning Valerius as if he no longer existed. He reached for Elira, his hand closing around her upper arm, his touch firm but not painful, and pulled her behind him. He shielded her with his body, a living wall of muscle and rage between her and the world. The gesture was so instinctive, so fiercely, unapologetically protective, it stole the breath from her lungs. A moment ago, she had been terrified of him. Now she felt a treacherous, shameful wave of safety wash over her. She hated his possessiveness, hated that he treated her like a thing to be owned, yet a deep, primal part of her craved the shelter of his shadow. The commotion had drawn attention. An elder, Lyran, one of the oldest on the council, appeared at the edge of the training yard, his face etched with concern. His ancient eyes, clouded with cataracts, widened in shock as they fell upon the delicate, shimmering moon mark on Elira's neck. His jaw went slack and the staff in his hand trembled. The prophecy, he rasped, his voice a dry, rattling thing filled with a terrifying mixture of awe and dread. By the ancient moon, it is complete. Kalen's head snapped toward him, his glare a potent warning to be silent. What prophecy, old one? Kalen's voice was a low threat. Lyran, however, seemed to have forgotten who he was speaking to, his gaze fixed on the miracle glowing on Elira's skin. For generations, it has been told, the old wolf whispered, his voice carrying on the night air. She who survives the throne's curse and bears the moon's mark will be the fulcrum of our destiny. He finally looked at Kalen, his eyes filled with a terrible weight. She will be the one to either save our pack from the coming darkness, or be the one to utterly destroy it. The elder's words descended upon the training yard like a shroud, suffocating and absolute. Elira felt the weight of them settle onto her shoulders, an invisible crown of terrifying consequence. Save them, or destroy them. She was no longer just an Omega servant, no longer just a fated mate. She was the axis upon which the entire world now turned, a living prophecy whose outcome was unknown. Kalen's grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles white, his body a rigid line of tension. He was a prince, trained for command and control, but this was a fate even he could not command. The sound of heavy armored footsteps announced the arrival of the Alpha King. He swept into the yard flanked by 4 of his most elite guards, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He had clearly been alerted to the Elder's proclamation, and his cold, calculating eyes immediately landed on the shimmering moon mark on Elira's neck. For one fleeting, unguarded second, the Alpha King looked afraid. It was a flicker of raw, primal fear in the eyes of a wolf who feared nothing. He saw the glowing mark not as a blessing, but as a threat he hadn't anticipated. But just as quickly as it appeared, the fear was gone, burned away by the familiar fires of his rage. "It is a trick," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous thing. "A dark magic deception. She is no one, a phantom conjured to spread dissent." "She is not," the elder Lyran whispered, stepping forward. The old wolf, usually so stooped and deferential, stood with a straightness Elira had never seen, filled with a sudden, unshakable courage. He held out a trembling hand, not at the king, but toward Elira. "Look, my king. Truly look at her. We have been blind." He took a step closer to her, his ancient eyes tracing the lines of her face. The curve of her jaw, the line of her brow, the eyes. They are not an Omega's eyes. They are the eyes of a ruler. He then turned, his gaze locking with the king's, and delivered the killing blow. "She has the face of the family we thought was lost forever. She has the face of Alpha Riker, the man you betrayed and exiled 20 years ago, the man who was the rightful heir to the throne before you." The world didn't just tilt. It shattered. Riker, her father's name. A name she had only heard in hushed, sad whispers from her mother long ago. A good man, a strong alpha, a loving father who, she'd been told, had abandoned his family and his pack for selfish reasons. A lie. It had all been a lie. She wasn't the daughter of a traitor. She was the daughter of a king. The rightful king. Her entire identity, the miserable, shameful cloak of a servant Omega she had worn her whole life, dissolved into dust. In its place was something vast, terrifying, and utterly unknown. She was the lost heir, the last of a murdered bloodline. Kaelin let go of her arm as if he'd been burned. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, and the devastation that washed over his face was absolute. He saw the truth of the elder's words in the regal lines of her face that he had somehow missed before. His expression broke, the pieces of his stony mask crumbling away to reveal the raw horror beneath. His father wasn't just a tyrant. He was a usurper, a murderer, and he, Kaelin, was now fated to the daughter of the man his family had destroyed. The bond between them was no longer just a complication. It was a testament to his family's greatest sin. The Alpha King's face hardened, his fear replaced by cold, brutal calculation. "She is a threat to my reign," he declared, his voice like the scrape of a blade on stone. "A ghost from the past that must be put to rest. Kill her. Kill the last of Riker's bloodline now." The command was as cold and final as a coffin lid shutting. Kill the last of Riker's bloodline. Elira heard the words, but her mind, still reeling from the cataclysmic revelation of her identity, couldn't fully process them. She was the daughter of a king. She was the rightful heir. And now, she was going to die for it. The 4 royal guards, hulking brutes in black iron pauldrons, moved as one. They raised their spears, the sharpened tips gleaming with deadly promise in the moonlight. Their faces were impassive, their movements efficient. They were the king's will made manifest, and his will was her death. Her life, which had become a dizzying whirlwind of terror and discovery over the past few days, was about to end. She was no longer just an inconvenient mate or a political problem. She was the living, breathing proof of the king's treason, a ghost who had returned to haunt the usurper, and he had to exorcise her with steel. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound, heartbreaking sense of injustice. She had lived her entire life as nothing, and now that she had finally discovered she was something, she was going to be erased. But Kaelin moved faster than the guards, faster than thought. He placed himself directly in front of her, a human shield of muscle and defiance. "No," he said, and the single word was a raw, guttural growl that promised violence. He spread his arms slightly, protecting her completely. The guards hesitated, their training warring with the instinct not to cross the future Alpha. "Defy me again, boy, and you will die with her," his father threatened, his voice laced with a venomous hatred that seemed directed more at his son than at Elira. He despised Kaelin's defiance, his perceived weakness. Kaelin stood his ground, trapped in an impossible choice. He looked from his father's murderous face, filled with a cold, unyielding fury, to Elira's. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the strength, the resilience, the face of the rightful heir. To fight for her now, against his father and the elite guard, would be suicide. They would both be cut down in moments. But to step aside and let them kill her, that was unthinkable. His wolf was a raging inferno in his mind, clawing at him, screaming, roaring to be let out, to slaughter every wolf who dared to threaten its mate. He had one option. One terrible, soul-shattering path that might, just might, give her a chance to survive this night. It would cost him everything. It would destroy a part of his soul. But it was the only way. He turned to face her, and the raw agony in his golden eyes was so profound it felt like a physical blow. He looked like he was the one facing execution. He reached up, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a gesture of such heartbreaking tenderness that it made her tears well up. For one beautiful, fleeting moment, the monster was gone, and she saw the man, the wolf, her mate, in his tortured gaze. He leaned in, his scent of pine and winter surrounding her, a final, cruel taste of what she could never have. Then his expression shuddered. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a mask of cruel, cold rejection so absolute it froze her blood. "You are nothing to me," he said, his voice a blade of ice that sliced through the fragile hope in her heart. A servant girl who got lucky. A lie. A ghost. He took a deep breath and delivered the final killing blow. "I, Kaelin, future alpha of the Black Moon Pack, I reject you as my mate." The words were an incantation of pure destruction. The bond between them, the humming, vibrant thread of fate, didn't just snap. It shattered into a million pieces of searing hot glass. An agony 1,000 times worse than what she'd felt in the dungeon ripped through her very essence. It was the pain of a soul being torn in half. A scream, raw and broken, tore from her throat as she collapsed to the ground. The glowing moon mark on her neck, the beautiful shimmering sign of their destiny, flickered violently, and then went dark, plunging her into an even deeper abyss. Pain was the first thing she knew. Not the sharp, soul-tearing agony of the rejection, but a dull, hollow ache that had settled deep in her bones. It was the pain of absence, the feeling of a phantom limb that had been brutally amputated. The bond was gone. Or perhaps, more accurately, it was severed, the raw ends of it left to fester inside her. Consciousness returned to her slowly, like a swimmer rising from a deep, dark ocean. She was no longer in the training yard. She was in a small, sparse room, lying on a narrow cot. The air smelled of dried herbs and clean linen. It was a healer's room, tucked away in a quiet corner of the keep. She sat up, her head spinning. The last thing she remembered was Kaelin's face, a mask of cruel rejection and then a darkness that had swallowed her whole. His words echoed in her mind. "You are nothing to me." A fresh wave of grief and fury washed over her, so potent it left her breathless. He had saved her from his father's guards only to execute her himself with his words. The cruelty of it was a masterpiece of pain. But as she sat there, wrapped in the hollow echo of the broken bond, something else began to stir within her. The grief was real. The fury was a fire in her blood. But beneath it all, an ember of something new began to glow. The revelation of her bloodline. She was the daughter of Alpha Riker. She was not nothing. She was the rightful heir to a stolen throne. They had taken everything from her, her father, her name, her birthright. They had left her to grow up in the dirt, a servant to the very man who had destroyed her family. And now they had tried to erase her completely. The ember of resolve glowed brighter, fanned by the winds of her rage. She would not let them. The rejection had been meant to break her, to leave her a hollowed-out shell. But they had miscalculated. They had broken the chain that tied her to Kaelin, and in doing so, they had set her free. Her destiny was no longer tangled with his. It was her own. And her destiny, she decided with a clarity that cut through the pain, was to uncover the truth. She would find out what really happened to her father. She would reclaim the story they had stolen from her. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. In the days that followed, she was left alone. The Alpha King seemed to have forgotten about her, content that the threat had been neutralized. Kaylin was a ghost, a presence she never saw. She was no longer a prisoner, but she wasn't free either. She was a political specter, adrift in the castle's halls, but her new purpose gave her strength. She began to listen, to watch. She learned the guards' patrol routes, the secret passages the servants used. She spoke to the oldest members of the kitchens, the ones who might remember the time before the current king's reign. She learned to be a shadow again, but this time, it was a shadow with a purpose. She didn't know that she was being watched. From the darkness, Kaylin observed her every move. The rejection had nearly killed him, the agony a constant grinding weight on his soul. But it had worked. His father believed the threat was gone, that Elira was just a broken, rejected mate. He had assigned guards to watch her, but Kaylin had replaced them with warriors loyal only to him. He ensured no one bothered her. When a brutish warrior tried to corner her in a hallway, the man was found the next morning with 2 broken legs and no memory of his attacker. Kaylin was her unseen guardian, her silent protector, bearing the agony of their separation as his own penance, while she unknowingly pursued the very truth he was now determined to help her find. Her first breakthrough came from an old she-wolf who had served her mother. "Your mother," the old wolf whispered, her eyes full of fear. She kept a hidden journal. She wrote everything down. She said the king's greatest secret was hidden in the heart of the mountain. The heart of the mountain. The words were a cryptic clue, a breadcrumb on a trail that had been cold for 20 years. But it was more than Elira had had before. The phrase pointed to one place, the sacred caverns deep within Mount Blackmoon, the place where alphas went to commune with their ancestors, a place forbidden to all but the royal bloodline, a place she now had a right to enter, though she knew to do so would be to sign her own death warrant if she were caught. She began planning, her mind sharp and focused. She had to get in, find her mother's journal, and get out without being seen. It was an impossible task. Her planning was cut short by a sudden, violent upheaval in the castle. Shouts echoed from the main courtyard. Guards were running, their armor clattering against the stone. A sense of panic, sharp and acrid, filled the air. Elira slipped out into a high gallery overlooking the courtyard, and her blood ran cold at the sight below. Kaylin was surrounded, not by his own guards, but by a dozen warriors from the Shadowcat clan, a mercenary band known for their ruthless efficiency. They were assassins. Their leader, a massive wolf with a scarred face, was circling Kaylin, a cruel smile on his lips. It was an ambush, a blatant, brazen attempt on the heir's life, right in the heart of his own keep. Kaylin fought like a cornered god of war. He moved with a liquid, deadly grace, his fists and feet a blur of motion. He took down 2 of the assassins before they could even draw their blades. But he was outnumbered. A blade sliced across his back, and he grunted in pain. Another caught him in the arm. He was bleeding, his movements becoming slower, his defenses starting to crumble. Where were the royal guards? Why was no one helping him? And then, Elira saw him, watching from the balcony of the throne room. The Alpha King. He stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, making no move to help his own son. He was letting it happen. He had orchestrated it. He was eliminating the last person who knew the truth about his treason. Something inside Elira snapped. The pain, the rejection, the hatred. It all vanished, burned away by a raw, primal instinct she couldn't control. Mine. The word was a silent scream in her soul. He was hers to hate, hers to defy. He was not theirs to kill. Before she even knew what she was doing, she was moving. She grabbed a heavy, decorative iron spear from the wall of the gallery. With a cry of pure, unadulterated rage, she launched it downward like a javelin. The spear flew true, its heavy tip catching the lead assassin in the shoulder just as he was about to deliver a killing blow to Kalen. The man roared in pain, staggering backward. The distraction was all Kalen needed. He exploded into motion, dispatching the remaining assassins with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. When the last one fell, he stood in the center of the courtyard, panting, bleeding, surrounded by bodies. His golden eyes found Alira in the gallery above. The look on his face was one of pure, stunned disbelief. She had saved him. The girl he had rejected, the mate he had shattered, had just saved his life. An arrow, fired from a hidden alcove, suddenly whistled through the air, aimed directly at his exposed back. "Kalen!" she screamed. She didn't think. She jumped from the gallery, a 12-foot drop, tucking and rolling as he had taught her. She slammed into him, shoving him out of the arrow's path. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her side as the arrow, meant for him, tore through her own flesh. A cry of agony escaped her lips as darkness swarmed at the edges of her vision. She collapsed into his arms, the scent of his skin and his blood filling her senses. He caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her, his face a mask of utter horror and devastation. He looked at the arrow protruding from her side, at her blood on his hands, and something inside him broke completely. He lowered her gently to the ground, his touch frantic. "No, no, Alira," he whispered, his voice cracking, the sound raw with a pain that had nothing to do with his own wounds. He pressed his hand to her side, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Why? Why would you do that?" He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers, all pretense gone, his soul laid bare in the bloody courtyard. "I did it to protect you," he choked out, the confession torn from the depths of his being. "The rejection, it was all a lie. I would burn the world down for you." Kalen's confession was the last thing Alira heard before the darkness claimed her. She drifted in a sea of pain and feverish dreams, but his words were an anchor, a single point of light in the suffocating blackness. It was all a lie. The truth of it settled into her soul, not as a comfort, but as a new and profound kind of agony. He hadn't rejected her out of cruelty. He had done it out of a desperate, twisted form of love. A love that had forced him to shatter her heart in order to save her life. It was a sacrifice so profound it made her own physical wound seem trivial. When she finally woke, she was back in the healer's room. The arrow had been removed, her side stitched and bandaged. The pain was a dull, constant throb. Kalen was asleep in a chair by her bed, his head slumped forward, his own wounds crudely bandaged. He looked exhausted, haunted. His face, in the soft morning light, was stripped of its usual hardness, revealing the lines of grief and torment beneath. He had not left her side. The healers had tried to make him leave, but he had refused, a silent, unmoving sentinel at her bedside. His presence was a quiet testament to the truth of his words. His father, the king, had spun a tale for the pack. He claimed the assassins were sent by a rival pack, a random act of aggression. He publicly praised Alira for her bravery in saving the prince, elevating her from a rejected Omega to a pack hero overnight. It was a clever political move, a way to control the narrative and quell any suspicion about his own involvement. But Kalen knew the truth. And now, so did Alira. The assassination attempt was his father's point of no return. The king was willing to murder his own son to protect his stolen throne. The time for silent maneuvering was over. While Alira recovered, Kalen began to move. His rejection of her had been a desperate gambit to protect her. Her sacrifice for him had been his final awakening. The debt he owed her was not just for his life, but for his soul. He could no longer stand by and watch his father's tyranny. He had to take the crown, not for power, but to protect the woman who was his fated mate, his queen. He began to plot in earnest, his actions swift and secret. He met with the warriors who were loyal to him, not to his father. He spoke with the elders who remembered his father's treason. He used his influence, his reputation as a ruthless warrior, to gather allies in the shadows. His rebellion was silent, a web of loyalty and secrets being woven right under the king's nose. He was no longer just the heir, waiting for his time. He was a revolutionary, preparing to seize it. A week later, as Elira was finally able to walk the castle halls again, a royal proclamation was made. The Alpha King, in an effort to secure a political alliance and further cement his power, was hosting a grand feast. At this feast, he would formally announce the betrothal of his son, Prince Kaelin, to Lady Seraphina, the daughter of the powerful Alpha of the Stonecrest Pack. The news was a calculated blow, a public declaration that the king was moving on, that the Omega problem was a thing of the past. For Elira, it was a cold reminder of her place. For Kaelin, it was the final insult. His father was not just a tyrant and a murderer. He was now trying to chain him to another, to sever the last, lingering hope of the fated bond he had with Elira. The king had just set the stage for his own downfall. He thought he was planning a betrothal feast. Kaelin knew he was planning a battlefield. The Great Hall was a gilded cage, a beautiful prison of glittering tapestries and flickering candlelight. The air, once choked with the scent of power, was now laced with something far more dangerous, the cloying sweetness of political maneuvering. Elira stood near the back, a ghost in a simple gray dress, her recently healed side aching with a phantom pain. The king had insisted on her attendance, a cruel power play to display her as a tamed, broken thing, the heroic servant who knew her place. Every laugh, every clink of a goblet felt like a stone thrown at her. She watched Kaelin, seated at the head table beside a stunningly beautiful she-wolf with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of emeralds. Lady Seraphina, his intended. Kaelin looked like a king carved from ice, his face a mask of cold, regal indifference. But Elira could see the truth. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clenched into a fist on his thigh, the storm of rebellion churning just beneath the surface of his golden eyes. The feast was a masquerade of false smiles and whispered pleasantries. The alliance with the Stonecrest Pack was a major coup for the Alpha King, and he was reveling in it, his voice booming across the hall. Elira felt 100 pairs of eyes on her throughout the night, their gazes filled with pity, scorn, and a morbid curiosity. She was the ghost at the feast, the living reminder of the prince's scandalous, rejected mate. She endured it, her new resolve a shield around her heart. She was not here as a victim. She was here as a spy, a queen in disguise, watching her enemy, learning his weaknesses. The moment of disaster came, as it always did, cloaked in a beautiful smile. It was Lady Seraphina's mother, a formidable she-wolf with eyes as sharp and cold as her daughters were warm. She rose from her seat, a goblet of wine in her hand, her voice ringing with false sincerity. "A toast," she declared, her gaze sweeping the room before landing, with surgical precision, on Elira. "To the Black Moon Pack and to its fascinating history. A history so rich, it seems, that some of its greatest treasures have been hidden in plain sight." A confused murmur rippled through the hall. The Alpha King's smile tightened. Kaelin went perfectly still. "I speak, of course, of this heroic Omega," the woman continued, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "The girl who saved our future Alpha. But is she just a servant? Or is she something more?" She paused, letting the tension build, savoring her moment. "My sources tell me a fascinating story. A story of a lost bloodline. The story of Alpha Riker's heir, returned from the ashes." Panic erupted. The name Riker was a forbidden word, a ghost from a bloody past. The hall exploded into a chaotic din of shouts and accusations. The Stonecrest Alpha looked at the king, his face a mask of betrayal and fury. This alliance was built on the foundation of the king's legitimate bloodline. A living, rightful heir shattered that foundation completely. The Alpha King's face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He had been exposed, his greatest treason laid bare in front of his most powerful allies. He rose to his feet, his eyes locking onto Elira, and the look in them was one of pure murder. This was no longer about politics. It was about survival. His survival. "Lies!" he roared, his voice shaking the very stones of the hall. "A traitor's poison! She is a threat, a spy sent to destroy us from within." He pointed a trembling finger at Elira, his face contorted in a snarl. "Seize her! Seize the witch! Her life is forfeit! I want her head on a spike before the moon is high!" Kalen shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. But it was too late. The king's personal guard were already moving, their swords drawn, closing in on Elira like a pack of wolves on a cornered deer. The world narrowed to a tunnel of terror. The shouting, the gasps, the chaos of the hall. It all faded into a distant roar. All Elira could see were the guards, their faces grim and determined, their polished steel blades hungry for her blood. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped. She looked across the hall, her eyes finding Kalen's. He was frozen, his face a mask of pure, agonized conflict. His hand was on the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white. She could see the war raging within him, the prince, the son, the mate, the revolutionary. If he drew his sword now, it would be a massacre. His loyalists would fight, the king's guard would retaliate, and the hall would run red with the blood of their own pack. This feast would become a slaughterhouse. His father saw the hesitation, the conflict, and he smiled, a cruel, triumphant twist of his lips. He had Kalen trapped. "Choose, my son," the king taunted, his voice a low, vicious thing meant only for Kalen to hear. "Your ambition, or the servant girl? You cannot have both." Kalen's gaze was locked with Elira's. In his eyes, she saw his desperate plan crumble, his silent rebellion threatened before it could even begin, and she saw his unbearable love for her, a love that was about to cost him everything. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't do it. Don't throw away your life, your pack, for me." The pain of that decision shattered him. He had to save her. He had to save his pack. The only way to do both was to destroy the one thing that connected them, to sever the link that made her a threat in his father's eyes. He had to make the world believe once and for all that she meant nothing to him. He took a step forward, his face hardening into a mask of such profound cruelty, it was more terrifying than his father's rage. "The woman is right," he said, his voice ringing with a cold, clear finality that cut through the chaos. "She is a witch, a manipulator who somehow survived the throne and has been poisoning this pack with her lies ever since." He walked toward Elira, each step a hammer blow to her heart. The guards parted for him. He stopped directly in front of her, his golden eyes filled with a chilling emptiness. "I rejected you once to save my own reputation," he snarled, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Now I cast you out to save the soul of this pack." He reached out, not to touch her, but to grab the simple leather cord around her neck, a trinket her mother had given her years ago. He ripped it from her, the cord breaking against her skin. "You are nothing. You are no one. You are a ghost, and I banish you to the darkness where you belong." The public, brutal finality of his words, combined with the physical act of tearing away her last connection to her past, was too much. The broken bond inside her didn't just ache, it hemorrhaged. A sharp, searing pain exploded in her chest, and the wound in her side, still tender from the arrow, ripped open from the sheer force of her body's trauma. A choked gasp escaped her lips. She looked down and saw a dark, wet stain spreading across the gray fabric of her dress. Blood. Her blood. The world swam, black spots dancing in her vision. The last thing she saw was the absolute horror dawning on Kalen's face as he realized what he had done. She collapsed to the floor, a broken doll in a spreading pool of her own blood. The sight of Elira falling, of her blood staining the ancient stones of the hall, shattered the last vestiges of Kalen's control. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart, around his wolf, crumbled into dust. The agony of the rejection, the sight of her dying, it was a nightmare, a ghost from his past come back to claim him. Camilla. The name screamed in his mind. He had lost her because he hadn't been strong enough, because he hadn't controlled the beast within. Now he was losing Elira because he had controlled it too well. He had caged the wolf, prioritized strategy and politics, and it had cost him everything. The pain from her severed bond slammed into him, a psychic backlash so violent it brought him to his knees. His wolf, which had been a raging storm in his mind, finally broke free. It roared with a grief and fury so profound it tore through his human consciousness, a wild, untamed thing that would no longer be denied. A guttural, inhuman snarl ripped from Kalen's throat. His body contorted, the sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh echoing in the horrified silence of the hall. His golden eyes began to glow with a feral inner light. He was not just a man anymore. He was the beast, unchained and unleashed. The Alpha King looked on, his eyes wide with a flicker of fear, but his cruelty won out. "She is dying," he sneered. "Finish it. Put the creature out of its misery and prove your loyalty." He drew his own ceremonial dagger, its edge gleaming in the firelight, and took a step toward Elira's still form, intending to deliver the final strike himself. That was the last mistake he would ever make. Kalen saw his father's intent, and the world went red. He looked at Elira, his mate, bleeding out on the floor because of his choices, because of his father's evil. He looked at the crown his father wore, the symbol of the power he had once craved, and in that moment of absolute clarity, he knew. The crown was worthless. The power was an illusion. His pack, his duty, his very soul, it was all meaningless without her. He had lived his life as a prisoner of his past, terrified of losing control, of becoming the monster that killed Camilla. But he was wrong. The real monster wasn't the beast inside him. It was the man who had raised him. The real cage wasn't his self-control. It was the throne. "No!" The word was a roar that was more wolf than man. He surged to his feet, no longer the prince, but a primal force of nature. He threw himself in front of Elira's body, shielding her from his father, his stance a declaration of war. He faced his father, his eyes glowing with a terrifying golden light. The transformation had been halted by sheer force of will, leaving him in a horrifying state between man and beast, a being of pure, unadulterated rage. He finally understood. Love wasn't a weakness to be hidden. It was a strength to be wielded. It was the only thing worth fighting for. "You will not touch her," he growled, the words vibrating with the power of his awakened wolf. He drew his own sword, the blade singing as it left the scabbard. "She is my mate. She is my life, and you are no longer my alpha." He raised his sword, its tip pointed directly at his father's heart, his voice echoing with the weight of destiny. "I, Kalen of the line of Riker's blood, challenge you for the throne, trial by combat, to the death." Kalen's challenge hung in the air, a thunderclap that shattered the last vestiges of order in the great hall. For a moment, the world stood still, suspended in a state of collective shock. A son had challenged his father. The heir had challenged his king. It was treason of the highest order, yet it was also a sacred ancient right. Trial by combat for the throne was the old law, a law that superseded any king's command. The Alpha King's face, which had been a mask of triumphant cruelty, twisted into a snarl of pure, unrestrained fury. He had been outmaneuvered, his authority undermined by a law so old even he could not defy it without losing the respect of his pack. "So be it," the king roared, his voice shaking with rage. "You have chosen your own death, boy." He gestured to his personal guard. "Clear the hall. The prince and I have a matter of succession to attend to." But the guards who had been moments from executing Elira were now faced with a far more terrifying threat. Kalen, in his half-shifted state, was a being of nightmare and legend. His form was larger, his muscles corded with a primal power. Claws tipped his fingers, and his face was a terrifying visage of wolf and man, his golden eyes glowing with an inner furnace of pure, untamed rage. He was no longer a prince. He was a force of nature. When the first of the king's guard tried to step past him to get to Elira's bleeding form, Kaelin moved. He was a blur of violence, a storm of gold and fury. He didn't use his sword. He used his claws. He ripped through the guard's armor as if it were parchment, tossing the hulking wolf aside like a broken doll. The other guards hesitated, their training no match for the primal fear that Kaelin now inspired. This was not the cold, controlled prince they knew. This was the beast that lived in the heart of all werewolves, fully unleashed and fighting for the one thing that mattered more than life itself: its mate. The great hall erupted into chaos. The nobles and guests screamed, scrambling for the exits. But not everyone fled. A handful of warriors, their faces grim and determined, drew their own blades. They were Kaelin's loyalists, the ones he had been secretly gathering. They moved to his side, forming a protective circle around him and Elira's body, their swords raised against the king's guard. The pack was broken. Brother turned against brother, the floor of the great hall becoming a battlefield. Kaelin paid them no mind. His entire world had narrowed to the still, pale woman on the floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, his monstrous form a stark contrast to the gentleness with which he touched her. His claws retracted, and his hand, now human but trembling, went to the wound in her side. It was slick with her blood, the life draining out of her, warm and terrifying against his skin. He could feel her life force fading, the faint spark of her soul guttering like a candle in the wind. The agony of the broken bond was a physical torment, but the agony of watching her die was 1,000 times worse. He pressed his forehead to hers, his own tears mixing with the blood on her skin. "No," he whispered, a broken, desperate prayer to a goddess he wasn't sure was listening. "Don't leave me. Elira, please. Don't leave." His wolf howled within him, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. It had failed to protect its mate. It had stood by while the man broke her. Now it would lose her. The Alpha King watched the scene with a cold, contemptuous smile. "Pathetic," he snarled, "weeping over a dead Omega. When I am done with you, I will throw her corpse to the dogs." That final cruel threat was the spark that reignited Kaelin's fury into a blazing inferno. He looked up, his glowing golden eyes locking with his father's. The time for grief would come later. Now was the time for vengeance. The duel for the throne was no longer about power or justice, it was about earning the right to save her. The chaos in the hall settled into a tense, deadly standoff. Kaelin's loyalists held a defensive circle, their swords pointed outward at the king's guard, who hesitated, unwilling to start a full-scale civil war without a direct command. The nobles who remained watched from the edges of the room, their faces pale with shock and fear. The duel was set. The Alpha King strode to the center of the cleared space, brandishing his massive two-handed broadsword. He was a formidable warrior, his body a mountain of muscle and battle scars, his skill honed over decades of brutal rule. Kaelin rose to his feet, leaving Elira's side for only a moment to face his father. The primal fury had receded, replaced by a cold, deadly focus. His form had settled back into something more human. But the beast was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, its power a live wire humming through his veins. "You have 5 minutes to prepare for your death," the king sneered, his confidence absolute. Kaelin ignored him. He walked back to Elira, kneeling beside her once more. Her breathing was shallow, her skin deathly pale. The healers were kept at bay by the standoff, unable to reach her. She was dying, and he was the only one who could save her. The rejection had shattered their bond, but it hadn't destroyed it. It was a living thing, a connection of souls, and though it was broken, the pieces were still there. He placed his hand over her heart, a heart that was beating slower and slower. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, shutting out the impending duel, and focused all of his will, all of his love, all of his desperate, primal need for her, into that single point of contact. He poured his own life force into her, his own alpha energy, trying to mend the severed connection with the sheer force of his devotion. "Stay with me," he pleaded, not with words, but with his soul. "I am here. I will not leave you. Fight." At first, nothing happened. The spark of her life continued to fade. But then, deep within her, something stirred. Her own wolf, the dormant, powerful alpha spirit of her bloodline, a spirit she had never known she possessed, sensed its mate. It sensed his desperation, his sacrifice. It sensed the threat to its other half. And for the first time in her life, it began to wake up. A faint, silvery light began to glow from her chest, seeping through the fabric of her dress. It was the moon mark, which had gone dark at the rejection, now flickering back to life, fueled by Kaelin's desperate energy. A collective gasp went through the room. The light grew stronger, warmer, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. A surge of energy, raw and powerful, flowed back from her into him. It was her power, her alpha heritage, awakened and answering his call. The shattered pieces of the bond didn't just reform. They reforged in a blaze of silver fire, creating something new, something infinitely stronger than before. Alira's eyes shot open. They were no longer the soft, uncertain eyes of an Omega. They were the brilliant, fierce, silver-glowing eyes of a true alpha. She took a sharp, deep breath, the air filling her lungs, her wound knitting itself closed under the healing power of the renewed bond. She sat up, her gaze finding Kaelin's. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but an equal, a queen. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. He shook his head, a look of pure awe on his face. "No," he breathed. "We saved each other." She rose to her feet beside him, no longer trembling, no longer weak. She was filled with a power she was only just beginning to understand. She was no longer a servant girl, no longer a pawn. She was the last of Riker's line, and she was here to claim her birthright. The Alpha King stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was no longer facing just his rebellious son. He was facing two alphas united by a bond blessed by the goddess herself. The sight of Elira rising, not just healed but transformed, sent a shockwave through the great hall. The moon mark on her neck now blazed with a steady, confident silver light, a beacon of undeniable power. Her presence had changed. She held herself with an innate authority, the bearing of a queen who had just remembered her own name. She and Kaelin stood side by side, a united front, their renewed bond a palpable force that crackled in the air between them. They were two halves of a whole, two alphas whose combined strength was far greater than the sum of their parts. The king's confidence, which had been so absolute moments before, was visibly shaken. He was a tyrant who ruled through fear and brutality, but what stood before him now was a power he didn't understand. It was divine right, made manifest. "This changes nothing," the king roared, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "The challenge was made. The trial stands." He gripped his broadsword, his knuckles white. He would not, could not, back down. To do so would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge their legitimacy. He lunged, not at Kaelin, but at Elira, a cheap, dishonorable tactic to catch them off guard. He thought her a weaker target. He was wrong. Elira didn't flinch. She moved with a speed and grace she hadn't possessed an hour ago, her awakened alpha instincts guiding her. She sidestepped his clumsy charge, her hand snatching a fallen sword from the floor as she moved. The king roared in frustration, spinning around to face Kaelin, who met his charge with a clash of steel that rang through the hall like a thunderclap. The duel began in earnest. It was a brutal, desperate dance of death. The king was a storm of brute force, his massive broadsword swinging in deadly arcs designed to smash through any defense. He fought with the rage of a cornered animal, a tyrant fighting to keep his stolen crown. Kaelin, in contrast, fought with a focused, deadly precision. He was the swift, flowing river that parts around the rock, his movements economical and precise. He was fighting for more than a crown. He was fighting for his mate, for his future, for the soul of his pack. He was fighting for redemption. Elira stood her ground, her borrowed sword held at the ready. She did not interfere directly, her instincts telling her that this was Kaelin's fight to win or lose. But she was not idle. She was his anchor, his other half. Through the bond, she fed him strength, her own newfound alpha energy flowing into him, sharpening his senses, fueling his stamina. She was his eyes and ears, calling out warnings as the king tried to use the debris of the hall to his advantage. "On your left!" she cried, and Kaelin spun just in time to parry a blow that would have taken his head off. They were a single fighting unit, their minds and souls linked in a perfect, deadly harmony. But the king was a veteran of 100 battles. He was stronger, and he knew every dirty trick. He feinted high, then kicked Kaelin's leg out from under him. Kaelin fell to one knee, his sword arm jarring against the stone floor. The king brought his sword down in a massive two-handed arc, an executioner's blow. Kaelin barely managed to get his own sword up to block it, the impact sending a shockwave through his body that numbed his entire arm. His muscles screamed in protest. He was tiring, his earlier wounds from the assassins taking their toll. The king pressed his advantage, raining down a relentless storm of blows, forcing Kaelin back, step by agonizing step. With a final, desperate heave, the king shattered Kaelin's guard. Kaelin's sword flew from his numb fingers, clattering across the floor. He was disarmed. He was on his knees. The king stood over him, his chest heaving, a triumphant, bloody smile on his face. He raised his broadsword for the final, killing strike. Hope, which had blazed so brightly just moments before, was about to be extinguished. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The king's broadsword, a river of dark, gleaming steel, began its final descent. Kaelin, on his knees and disarmed, looked up, his golden eyes meeting his father's, not with fear, but with a calm, unwavering defiance. He had done all he could. He had won the one thing that mattered, Elira's life. And if the price for that was his own, he would pay it without regret. He saw a flicker of movement behind his father, a gray blur of impossible speed. He saw his father's triumphant smile curdle into a mask of pure, agonized shock. He saw Elira. She had moved with the speed of a striking viper, her awakened alpha power a silver flame propelling her across the stone floor. She didn't try to meet the king's broadsword with her own smaller blade. It would have been a futile gesture. Instead, she used the skills Kaelin had so brutally drilled into her. Your center of gravity is low. Use it. Use their arrogance against them. She slid across the floor, a low, perfect sweep of her leg hooking the king's ankle. It was a servant's move, a trick of the unnoticed, amplified by an alpha's power. The king, his balance completely committed to his overhead strike, was caught completely off guard. He was a mountain, but even mountains can fall. He crashed to the ground with a thunderous impact that shook the entire hall, his broadsword flying from his grasp and skittering into the shadows. Elira was on her feet in an instant, her own sword now leveled at the fallen king's throat. But she did not strike. Her silver eyes, blazing with a cold, clear light, met Kaelin's. Together. The word was a silent thought that passed between them through the living conduit of the bond. Kaelin surged to his feet, snatching his own sword from the floor. He moved to her side, and they stood together over the fallen tyrant, their blades crossed above his chest. A perfect mirrored image of shared power and purpose. The king stared up at them, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He saw not his son and a servant girl. He saw two true alphas, their souls linked, their power a unified, unbreakable force. He saw the end of his reign. "It is over," Kaelin said, his voice quiet, but filled with the unshakable authority of a true alpha. "Your lies are done. Your reign of blood is over." The king spat on the floor. "You think you have won? The pack will never follow you, a broken prince and his omega whore." The insult was his last mistake. A low growl rumbled in Elira's chest, a sound of pure, dominant power that shocked even herself. "I am no whore," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of her bloodline. "I am Elira of the House of Riker, the last of the true blood, and you are a usurper who sits on a throne of stolen bones." She pressed the tip of her sword against his throat, a single drop of blood welling up on his skin. "Yield the crown, or forfeit your life." The king stared into her silver eyes and saw his own death reflected there. He saw the ghost of the man he had betrayed, returned in the form of his daughter to claim her vengeance. He saw the unshakable devotion in Kaylin's gaze, a love so powerful it had literally brought her back from the dead. And in that moment, he knew he was defeated. His strength, his brutality, his fear. It was all nothing in the face of a power like theirs. With a final, shuddering breath of defeated rage, he sagged against the floor, the fight draining out of him. The hall was utterly silent, every wolf watching, waiting to see what their new rulers would do. The central conflict was over. The tyrant was defeated. Now, a new reign had to begin. The silence that followed the king's defeat was absolute. It was a heavy, breathless quiet filled with the unspoken questions of an entire pack whose world had just been turned on its head. They had witnessed the fall of a tyrant, the return of a lost heir, and the miracle of a bond blessed by the goddess herself. They now looked upon Kaylin and Elira, not with fear or scorn, but with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, waiting to see what kind of rulers they would be. Would they be vengeful? Would they be just? Would they rule with a fist of iron, as the last king had? The defeated king lay on the floor, his life hanging by the thread of their mercy. Kaylin looked down at the man who was his father, at the source of all his pain and torment. His wolf screamed for vengeance, for the blood debt to be paid in full. But when he looked at Elira, he saw not a thirst for blood, but a deep, weary desire for peace. He saw a queen who wanted to heal, not to break. He sheathed his sword. "Take him to the dungeons," he commanded the guards, his voice ringing with the calm authority of a true alpha. "He will await the pack's judgment." The guards, who had served the king moments before, now obeyed their new alpha without hesitation, hauling the former king away. With the tyrant gone, all eyes were now on Kaylin and Elira. The throne, the symbol of ultimate power, sat empty at the head of the hall. Tradition dictated that Kaylin, as the victor of the duel, should now take that seat and claim his crown. He was the Alpha King. But he did not move toward the throne. Instead, he turned to face Elira. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a love and reverence so profound it was a physical presence in the room. He saw the servant girl who had been invisible. He saw the prisoner who had defied him. He saw the warrior who had saved him. He saw his mate, his queen, his everything. In a move that stunned the entire pack, Kaylin, the victor, the new Alpha King, dropped to one knee before her. He bowed his head in a gesture of absolute submission and devotion. He took her hand, the one not holding the sword, and brought it to his lips. "Elira of the House of Riker," he said, his voice clear and strong, for all to hear. "I was a prisoner of my own past, a king of a frozen heart. You broke down my walls. You saved me from my own darkness, my life, my soul, my pack. It is all yours, if you will have it." He then looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "Be my Luna. Be my queen. Rule beside me, as my equal." Tears streamed down Elira's face, not of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it threatened to break her heart open. She had gone from a ghost to a queen, from nothing to everything. She pulled him to his feet, her silver eyes shining. "Always," she whispered, a vow that was both an answer and a prayer. He smiled, a true, radiant smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. He leaned in front of the entire pack, he gently bit the soft skin of her neck right over the glowing moon mark. It was not a violent, possessive claiming. It was a tender, reverent seal. A wave of pure, golden light erupted from the point of contact, a bonfire that washed over both of them, healing their remaining wounds, soothing their scarred souls, and merging them into one. As the light faded, every wolf in the great hall, the nobles, the warriors, the elders, Kaelin's loyalists, and the king's former guards dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in unison. They were no longer a broken pack. They were whole, united under their new Luna Queen and her Alpha King. Elira took her place on the Alpha's throne, the ancient, cursed ironwood that had started it all. She settled onto the polished seat, not with the terror of a clumsy servant, but with the quiet, confident grace of a queen returning home. The wood beneath her felt not cold and menacing, but warm and welcoming, humming with an ancient energy that recognized her as its rightful occupant. Kaelin did not take a seat beside her. Instead, he stood on the dais just below her, a half step behind, his traditional place as her sworn protector and partner. It was a powerful, symbolic gesture that all in the hall understood. Their rule would not be one of dominance, but one of partnership. She was the heart of the pack, and he was its sword and shield. Her transformation was complete. The girl who had made herself invisible to survive was now the most visible wolf in the kingdom, seen and revered. The Omega who had been convinced she was unworthy of love was now the center of a love so powerful it had rewritten their destiny. Her journey from self-erasure to self-sovereignty was finished, and Kaelin, at her side, was finally whole. The scars on his face remained, but the deeper scars on his soul, the ones left by his guilt and his father's cruelty, had been healed by the light of her love. He was no longer a prisoner of his past, no longer a monster terrified of his own heart. He was a redeemed protector, a devoted mate, an alpha who had found his true strength not in a crown, but in the love of his queen. They ruled with a wisdom and compassion the pack had not known in a generation. Elira's innate empathy, born from a life in the shadows, allowed her to understand the needs of the lowest among them. Kaelin's strength and strategic mind ensured the pack's safety and prosperity. They rebuilt what the old king had broken, mending the alliances, healing the old wounds, and creating a kingdom where strength was measured, not by dominance, but by loyalty and unity. Her father's journal, which they later recovered from the sacred caverns, confirmed the full extent of the old king's treason and guided them in restoring the pack's honor. That night, they stood on the highest balcony of the keep, the full moon hanging like a silver medallion in the inky black sky. The cool night air was a soothing balm, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a peaceful future. Kaelin wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the moon-drenched lands that were now theirs to protect. "I never thought this was possible," Kaelin murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "To feel peace." Elira leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand covering his over her heart. The moon mark on her neck pulsed with a soft, gentle warmth. "We are not the story my father or your father wrote for us," she said softly. "We are the one we wrote for ourselves." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. The core emotional question that had haunted her for so long, "Am I truly unworthy of love?" was finally answered. She was not just worthy. She was chosen. She was cherished. She was home. Under the watchful eye of the moon goddess, they whispered promises of a new dawn, of a shared future, of a love that had been forged in fire and blessed by the stars. Their forever had just begun.